This video was produced using images and information from the Aspen Historical Society, and I would just like to thank them for their help. Hi everyone, or as Carol Baskins would say, hi all you cool cats and kittens. My name is Veronica. I'm the team lead for the Wilderness Crew this coming summer here in our Aspen Sopers Ranger District. Previous to working for the Forest Service, I worked for the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. Some of you will get to know the naturalists this coming summer, some of you may not. Typically they are up here running tours, talking about the wildlife, talking about the Ute peoples who are our native peoples here, the miners, all the human history and geology. Who knows what this year will look like, but that's typically what they do. And so I did that for 2 years. I lived up at Ashcroft at Toklat. Super lucky to have lived up there. And I really have enjoyed getting to know this place through that lens of being a part of our ecological community and a part of our sometimes shameful, but ultimately at least interesting, if nothing else, historical context here in this valley. I wanted to share a little bit of that with you all because I feel that when I'm making field contacts, especially, or even when I'm just working in the office, it can really enrich my perspective and my experience, and I hope it does the same for you. I hope this isn't just a boring video that you turn off after a couple minutes, like, oh, blah, blah, this chick's just talking a lot about random plants and things, and it's not very interesting. I hope that's not how you feel. Anyhow, I'm going to back up a little so that you can get a better look at my surroundings, and you won't be able to see my face as well, unfortunately. Well, you might have a different opinion. Anyway, all right. There we go. Cool. All right. Not bad, right? Yeah, pretty awesome. This place is massive, awe-inspiring. The first time I saw these mountains, I was completely blown away, especially by the fact that you can walk from right here to the top of those peaks. You might have to do a little bit of scrambling, but you can walk there. It's within walking distance, and it's just wild to be like, wow, this huge, vast place is something that I can travel in and witness and be a part of. Tremendously exciting. These vast places seem beyond our reach in many ways. The whole idea of wilderness is somewhere untrammeled by man, right? And that means that we have not influenced it too much, or maybe in the future we're trying not to influence it. Essentially, wilderness is supposed to be a place unaffected by us, right, and beyond us. But it's not. Nothing is, which is kind of unfortunate in ways. So when we look at this place, we can see that it is really wild and big, but it's also something that we influence not only when we consume fossil fuels and contribute to climate change, or, you know, buy beef or whatever at the grocery store and maybe contribute to climate change, but this is somewhere that we can touch directly, and that has actually been touched directly by people, human beings, for thousands of years. The real theme that I wanted to communicate today, though, is we have that relationship, right? We have that back and forth. We influence this place, and it can influence us. It can open us up to new experiences. It can make us feel way better when we just go for a hike out there. It can really influence us in amazing ways. Oh man, this is distracting. I'm gonna turn this a little bit. But I think it's our company in more than that regard. It is also our company insofar as we are not the only species to suffer what seems like an apocalypse, a pandemic, terrible things. We are not the only ones to suffer from parasites and bacteria and viruses. And I'm going to talk, just because I know that some of you might be familiar with some of the things I'll talk about, I'm going to try to talk about those too, so that we can get some weird fun facts in there, and not just stuff that everybody's heard already. You know, spruce galls, those galls on the branches of spruce trees. We've got weird fungi that parasitize things. We've actually even got some wildflowers that act as parasites. And I'll get into all of that during my discussion. But if I had to boil this whole thing down, it would be that we feel really isolated right now. We feel alone. I'm not wearing a mask right now because nobody else is here with me, but if someone were nearby, I would have to wear a mask. And that in itself can feel really isolating, or even just the process of having to think through every action that you do is exhausting. but we're not alone. It may be depressing to realize that ecological rules do apply to us too. We can't cheat all of them, but it can also be encouraging, or at least we can feel, again, like at least maybe we have some friends or community members, so to speak, that have been through the same things. It didn't end well for all of them, it doesn't end well for all of them, but we can find some commonality there. I hope that you're able to, through some of the things that I say, and I hope some of the things are new to you. Thank you. Alright, so just because not everyone will know their way around, I decided to show you all a map. This is Independence Pass. We'll come on down and take a look. It's on the Continental Divide, which, as most of you probably know, means on the east side, rivers will flow toward the Atlantic. On the west side, rivers will flow toward the Pacific of this divide, kind of the spine of the U.S. Off of this Highway 82, you can access the Hunter Frying Pan Wilderness and the Collegiate Peaks Wilderness. Here's Aspen. Many of you will be living here in the bunkhouse or working out of the Maroon Bells office here, or the Wilderness office. That's the Hunter Frying Pan Wilderness, and on the other side you have the Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness. So wilderness kind of surrounds the town, which is really cool. Come on down to Ashcroft. Ashcroft is a historic mining town. Today it's a ghost town. Time that we spend up there could be with the dispersed crew. The dispersed crew will be checking campsites up there every so often. We have a bathroom up there and a permittee up there, and then also you can access the wilderness from Cathedral Lake or American Lake trailheads. Or Conundrum is actually up Castle Creek Road as well. Castle Creek Road is the road to Ashcroft. Alright, and here's Maroon Lake. Pretty beautiful spot. If you're on the Bells crew, you'll definitely be spending time there, but a lot of us will be spending time there. There's a lot of work to do and great access for the wilderness. Here's Snowmass. Snowmass, another access point for the wilderness in the summer, lots of hiking. Ordinarily there'd be a concert series, but not this year. And in the winter, it's pretty bumpin' over there. A lot of skiing. Here's Basalt. Basalt Mountain has some trails that we maintain. No wilderness right out of town, but we do have a workstation and some housing in Basalt. Nice spot. And here's Root Eye. I took you to Root Eye because there are a few different hiking accesses up there, a lot of non-wilderness trails, overlooking the reservoir and just kind of around the reservoir, and then Holy Cross and Hunter Frying Pan further up the road. There's Carbondale. That's where the main Forest Service offices are, so a lot of your supervisors work there. Here's Sopris, which if you have driven by Carbondale, you've definitely noticed. It is not as tall as it looks, but it has a huge elevation gain just from the valley floor, so that's why it's so dramatic. Not a volcano, by the way. Redstone, another access point for the wilderness and some camping and dispersed sites. Really cute little town on the Crystal River. And here's Marble, which is where you can access Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness or the Raggeds. Slow Graven Barbecues out there. Kind of a cool little spot to explore. And these are just kind of all of the little towns in the area and the different forest accesses. You'll get to know them better over time. Many of you, again, already know this. All right, now that we've reached the last few seconds of our geologic timeline, I'm going to discuss the human history of the area, since the ecology is kind of slower moving, right? And so it took a lot of time to evolve. I'll just talk about the human story here. The human story is full of just as much kind of apocalyptic and terrifying change as the geologic story in some ways, right? Like, we don't have huge volcanoes erupting anymore, or poisonous gases, or seas coming and going, at least right now that we can notice, but there has been much change that has happened many times, and these folks pictured here are definitely some people who could tell you about that. They existed here for thousands of years. It's fairly well substantiated now that they were here at least 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, so really, I mean, exponentially longer in ways than our nation, the US, has existed, right? They existed in family units in the summer. They're the Ute Indians, by the way. So these are the Utes. And the Utes, like I said, were in family bands in the summer, roaming in the high valleys, up close to the alpine and subalpine, so 9,500 feet and higher in the summers, hunting mostly elk and deer, but they would also hunt other animals. And in the winter, they would come down lower and gather together just to weather those harsh, dark, long nights and share supplies. I imagine they caught up with each other. And we had two different bands that ranged here, the Peronoche and the Tabaguache. A lot of historical sources that are not written by Utes, or they're a little less recent, will just say they're the White River Band, but it seems to be more complex than that. You can find, or you could find, at least in the early 20th century, the remains of the Utes on Red and White Hills above Carbondale. They had an old encampment at Penny Hot Springs that I'm sure has kind of just been wiped out of existence. And they used to have a pretty well-used campsite where Root Eye is now. And their trails were in strong evidence as well when people started to settle their land. In 1863, there was a treaty that relegated them to the southwest corner of the state. In 1868, a line was drawn to the 107th meridian, and that's the first thing that opened the Aspen area to settlement. So down the valley from Aspen, people were not allowed, but after 1868, people could settle in Aspen. And they didn't quite start doing this. There are accounts of some squatters kind of near Schofield in 1870 that the Utes kicked out. But 1874, Hayden and his survey did come through and survey the area with their chef, Potato John Raymond. Ha ha ha. That's for real. His name was that. And that happened actually relatively peacefully. And over time, unfortunately, the government started to, put Indian agents, is what they were called, in place and force the Utes essentially to adopt habits that the white men thought were beneficial, but that really went against their ways of life and their culture that they had practiced for, again, thousands of years in this area with great success. They were a huge part of this ecosystem and its life. And so, especially in 1879, that ill will kind of came to a head in Meeker, and the Meeker massacre occurred. One Indian agent, Nathan Meeker, and his family were killed. And while this was a violent incident, it was almost more of a pretense to kick the Utes off their land. The last Ute was driven out of the valley in 1881. The miners started coming in 1879. They came over the high passes primarily, so Taylor Pass and Independence Pass. And they settled quite high. Ashcroft is around 9,500 feet. Independence, it seems to me at least to be higher than that. I'm not sure its elevation. And they started staking claims. The Hayden survey would have told them that it made sense to do so, that there was some potential in the area for mining of various minerals. Many found silver, but gold was also found up near the pass. Eventually, iron would be mined here, zinc, various other substances. So many different mines in the area. And towns like Ashcroft didn't persist as long, so these higher towns, but Aspen was extremely prosperous. Gentlemen like this were probably veterans of the Civil War, so kind of survivors of a great and violent event as well. I always had a hard time thinking of them in a three-dimensional way, and learning or realizing that they had been through things like that was kind of made them more into human beings to me. So I thought that was an interesting fact. And there's actually a Civil War cemetery in Aspen. Pictured here is a wilderness ranger after patrol. No, just kidding. It's a miner drinking a beer. He's unnamed in the caption on the photo. So cannot help you with his name, unfortunately. Unfortunately, mostly the names of the speculators seem to have survived the test of time. Mostly just the wealthy men who invested here, not the actual people who put work in every day in the mines or who died in avalanches. So Hallam, Wheeler, Hopkins, these were all wealthy gentlemen who came in from out of town and invested in the mines. Here I just decided to walk through the ghost town of Ashcroft just to kind of show you what these old towns look like now, the ones that were disused anyway. We have several in the area besides Independence and Ashcroft. There's also a town site called Ruby up at the end of Lincoln Creek Road. And other places, if you hike around here, no doubt you will find the remnants of old towns. Gothic. Schofield was a town. Apparently Ulysses S. Grant actually visited Schofield, and they gave him homemade whiskey that was pretty close to being poisonous. It's according to Len Shoemaker's book. Anyhow, so 1879 is when they initially settle. They do pretty well. You can see that there are wood structures, and these were restored in the 1970s, but they were building even a few two-story buildings, which was kind of a big deal for the time. Sometimes these settlements were so temporary that you wouldn't even bother to do something like that. So you can see that they at least felt this place had some kind of future. In 1885, they started building a railroad to Aspen, and as you can imagine, things are really harsh up here. I mentioned avalanches, and so many men were dying in avalanches. It's hard to grow food up here, really challenging, and they were hunting and fishing, but they actually overhunted and overfished, so things were getting kind of tough. And at the same time that railroad's being built to Aspen, Colorado Midland and the Rio Grande railroads were both trying to get to Aspen first, and they both arrived in 1887. So that kind of inspired people to head down the valley and just make a life there, and also they were hitting really, really rich lodes of especially silver near Aspen. So it seemed like a better employment move. It seemed really profitable to move down there. Around this time, a gentleman named William Weaver was one of the first people to plant dandelions in the valley. And so now we can talk about some of the environmental degradation these men perpetrated here. I'm talking about silver mining and timber. In 1892, after silver was monetized, Aspen was the third largest city in Colorado at that time. So really, almost 13,000 people lived here. And you can see this is Aspen Mountain. It is so logged out as to be unrecognizable. You can see it's bald. So they did a lot of timber harvesting here. Like I said, they pretty much locally exterminated elk. They exterminated wolves in the area. They practically exterminated the cutthroat, not quite. This is the Little Nell ski run here. Also back in that era. You can see again, just really, really degraded here. Anyhow, so lots of timber harvest, lots of hunting because they were having to make a living, especially before there was a better supply line in here. And then in 1893, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed, and this place crashed. But some people still lived here, as you can see. This is actually a photo from 1915, and that's when they reintroduced elk. So most of our elk that are here today are actually from Wyoming, and they were reintroduced again in 1915. Brought here by train, and I guess they just opened it up and let them go. They released elk in a few different places in the area. I think one of them was up near Smuggler Mountain, if I remember correctly from Len Shoemaker's book. And just as we continue looking through pictures of these times, we'll start to discuss the actual kind of Forest Service history here. So in 1905, the Holy Cross Forest Reserve was designated. Teddy Roosevelt designated that, and so kind of a lot of the area around Aspen became a part of a national forest, which was met with mixed reactions. A lot of the cattlemen really did not like that. So in 1907, Aspen was kind of at the head of a lot of the biggest grazing issues of the area. You can see this is Crater Lake. This photo is from the early 1900s. The Sopris unit was separated from the Holy Cross Forest Reserve in 1909. And so then this area would have been more part of the Sopris unit. I think we also have some of the old Holy Cross on our district as well. Pictured here is the Len Shoemaker that I've mentioned time and time again during this little talk. He was one of the first Forest Service rangers here, or one of the earlier ones anyway. He started as a ranger in 1913 and was made district ranger of this area in 1918. Kind of in the era between 1918 and 1920, he's responsible for naming quite a few of the landmarks that we know today, or at least for documenting the history behind their names as well. I found his stories really helpful in learning about this area. And he was actually one of the earliest advocates of a paved road to the Maroon Bells. And in the 1930s, somebody actually listened to him. Pictured here are the 10th Mountain Division gentlemen. So in the 1930s, we did have some early skiers visiting the area. The Highland Bavarian Corporation was founded, but these 10th Mountain Division guys were really important to the skiing that carries through to now. 10th Mountain Division Hut Association and Aspen Skiing Company. These are just two examples of things that these men eventually contributed to here in Aspen and the Roaring Fork Valley. This is Walter and Elizabeth Pepke. They are the two who are responsible for the Aspen Institute, the Aspen Music Festival, the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, so kind of creating this intellectual tradition in Aspen and cultural tradition, but they are also responsible for bringing in kind of the class element that exists in Aspen today, where we have the ultra-wealthy coming in. These two are like moderately wealthy for the time, but like pretty wealthy, and very wealthy compared to the locals. And so those two started the tradition of ultra-wealthy people coming in, investing in this area, purchasing homes, and kind of creating it into a vision of what they liked. This is actually a photo taken from the Highlands Ski Resort, and you can see, there's the bells. Aspen Highlands was actually not a part of Aspen Skiing Company initially. It was owned by a gentleman named Whip Jones. 1967 is when Snowmass Mountain became a part of the skiing company, and this didn't pass into the hands of skiing company until the late 80s, kind of early 90s. So Aspen Highlands was an independent agent for quite some time, and you could actually ski the bowl before it was mitigated for avalanches in the 70s, but it was very dangerous. You bought like an extra day's lift tickets, and that eventually became illegal, and so then they did have to do mitigation. So just to kind of wrap all of this up, I talked for much longer about the older history of this place, right? I mean, the Utes were the majority of this place's human history, thousands of years. And then quite a bit of time spent on the miners. There's a lot more to find out about this area and its history, a lot more interesting stories, and at the end of the video, I will include some of my sources if you're curious to do more reading. But that kind of takes us from the Utes to the present day, roughly, and now we will talk about the ecology. And now just to shift our lens, now that we've come up to the present day, I'm going to talk about our local ecology, which is also our place in history, right? And our ecology has evolved over a very, very long period of time, and right now it is rapidly changing. All right, great. So here I decided to try to show you all a few different life zones. Especially here, you can kind of see the very, very upper end of the montane life zone, which is around 7,500 feet to 10,000 feet-ish. So the montane life zone can be characterized by sometimes mixed coniferous forest, often aspen forest, sagebrush up to 8,500 feet, and oak up to 8,500 feet. And some of these elevations can really vary based on aspect. So if it's south-facing, it gets a lot of sun. You can see kind of lower elevation plants sometimes up high just because it's a southern aspect. We've got subalpine, that's 9,500 feet to 11,500 feet. You're definitely seeing those subalpine forests higher up. Those tend to be dominated by spruce and fir. And we've also got the alpine represented here in this video, which is anything 11,400 feet and above. And all of these can, again, like I was saying, really be influenced by microclimates, so by aspect, by how sheltered they are, really by those particularities of geography and just exactly how the sun hits an area can really, really affect what's growing in these places. So it's really fun when you're hiking to just pay attention to the microclimates. Great, so took you all to the Bells because this is a great spot to see how dynamic our ecosystems are. And continue with that theme of disastrous change, this is a really dynamic ecology, and it's defined by disaster and apocalypse. I mean, look, this is a rock glacier that I'm focusing on, so really dynamic environment. There's ice buried under that, and it means those rocks constantly move. It's hard for things to grow, but they still do, to a certain extent. Avalanches can really change the land, but also can promote biodiversity, and we also have a landscape that can be defined by fire. Lodgepole pines need fire to reproduce, and that can increase wildflowers. So while these disasters too will look really different because we're experiencing climate change, we won't get the same results that we have, right? These things, again, evolved over thousands and thousands of years. And so they're very well adjusted to those fast changes, like an avalanche or fire, but the other fast change happening might make these things look really different. So an avalanche or fire in this area, if you don't think of, human homes being built in places where they're vulnerable, they're not necessarily a tragedy. They just might be now because things have changed. Great. So speaking of human influences on the environment, the plant that I wanted to start with here is a shrub. This is a gooseberry shrub, a red currant. You can see the thorn right next to that leaf, kind of terminus. And the reason why I bring them up in connection with humans is because you can see this bush is planted right outside the Blue Mary Saloon. And if you look over to this remnant of a cabin, over to the remnant of some of these stores, post offices, cabins, you can see that these bushes are growing there. They were actually planted to provide the folks living here with vitamin C, because If you can think, back then it wasn't always easy to get supplies. You don't want to get scurvy. And it's not always easy to be growing fruits and vegetables. So you're going to grow whatever you can. And gooseberries are native. You'll see them all over. They're totally edible. They're very tart. I've eaten them in pies or just eaten them raw. And we have several different species of gooseberry. So some of them don't even have thorns. Wolf's red currant doesn't have, doesn't have thorns at all. So you can delve more into this in a book. If you'd like, in a guidebook, I have a recommendation for you that I will talk about later. All right. Just really quick to get a little more into shrub ID, I always ask if the twigs are opposite or alternate first. We do have ash maple dogwood. This is a rose bush. You can see the rose hip in my hand, and it is alternate. The twigs are alternate, as you could see earlier. And this is a honeysuckle bush. Its twigs are opposite. You can see that the twigs always grow symmetrically opposite each other. And so it'll help you narrow things down a lot. Honeysuckle, maple, ash, dogwood, we do have dogwoods here, a shrubby dogwood. Those are always going to be opposite, with opposite growing twigs. A willow, like I'm showing you now, a rose bush, gooseberry, those are alternate. And so often alternate trees and shrubs are much more common, and so opposite or alternate twigs can help you narrow it down. I was showing you these willows because I kind of noticed something cool while I was up at the bells. You can see they're starting to get their seeds. And a lot of trees or shrubs are either dioecious or monoecious. And monoecious means that male and female reproductive organs grow on the same tree or shrub. So they have male and female on the same individual. Willows and aspen trees in the willow family, so aspen trees as well, are dioecious. So they have male and female individuals. This is a male catkin, which is the name for a willow seed. You can see the yellow dust, the pollen, so sperm cells basically, that rubbed off on my hand. And I pulled this off one of those willow shrubs. I thought it was interesting because I was seeing a lot of these male pollen-covered catkins, but not that many female catkins, which was just kind of interesting to me. You'd think it wouldn't work out very well for them, but who knows. We have several species of willow here. It's pretty hard to distinguish between them, and some of them I'm pretty sure can hybridize. So if you really want to get into shrub ID, you could get into identifying different willows, but personally, I haven't as much, even though they have some cool human uses. These are green gentian or monument plant stalks. These are from last year's bloom. Monument plants, or again, green gentian in the gentian family. They can live from anywhere from 20 to 80 years, so wildly varying lifespans, and they die as soon as they bloom. So they spend their whole lives, be them, 20, 40, 80 years, saving away energy, and we're not sure exactly what stimulates them to bloom, but kind of in this big push, this big change, they shoot up these big towers, and they put all of their remaining energy into these blooms. They're really beautiful flowers. It's a tall column of greenish flowers with little red stripes on them. And it seems to be fairly successful. You can see the little cabbage-like herbaceous growths of them coming back from that last year. I wanted to show you all this little plant just because when I'm identifying flowers, I like to go by family, and there's certain characteristics for each family, and this one is really obvious. You can see parallel leaf veins. They're all going the same direction. They're all parallel to each other. It's characteristic of the lily family. And so when you can identify family characteristics like that, it can really help you narrow things down. So that's why I included that plant. This is a cow parsnip, many of you might know. A young one, they'll get pretty tall. They'll get almost like waist high. Sometimes they can act as a skin irritant to folks. The root is actually edible if cooked. Although I'm not endorsing any decisions to eat wild plants if you do not know what you're looking at. So please make good choices. I just showed you this one just because of the interesting property of the skin irritant in its leaves. It doesn't affect everyone, and it's mostly a function of sun exposure. So the particular compound that they have in their leaves is actually kind of activated by the sun, or rather it makes your skin less able to defend itself from UV radiation. And so when you touch it, if you're genetically predisposed, so you're sensitive to this chemical, and then you get the sun on your skin, that's when you might get a really bad rash or really bad sunburn. which is why they're really interesting to me. That's just wild that they can secrete those chemicals. I couldn't tell you exactly why, like what the evolutionary purpose would be, but maybe that irritant's supposed to make them less attractive to eat, and the fuzz. These are lupin leaves. I was kind of forced to show you all just plants in the early spring. Not everybody's blooming yet. They're a legume, and you can see the wagon wheel shaped leaf. And so later they'll get those little towering, really pea plant looking blooms with the prow and that really particular shape. Here is a pasque flower. I love these. They're often one of the earliest flowers to appear in the spring. They are in the buttercup family, and the buttercup family produces a lot of alkaloids and really toxic compounds, and so they can slow down your heart. I wouldn't eat the leaves of these guys. This is candy tuft, mustard family, which you can tell because there's 4 petals on each flower. You can eat these little flowers, just leave enough for them to reproduce. They're pretty sweet for a mustard. So candy tuft, also one of the earlier wildflowers. And this one I wanted to show you all because I discovered this one this year, and I identified it for the first time this year. This is woolen breeches, or ball-headed waterleaf. It's in the waterleaf family. Just like a hidden treasure there under the leaf. Ah, so nice. And these are lance leaf violets, the yellow flowers of the violets. I know, weird. And then those other ones are dwarf bluebells. Bluebells, kind of counterpart, you'll get taller bluebells right next to the streams, and that's a slightly different species. And just to zoom in on the violets here, you can see their lines coming out of kind of the deeper part of the flower where the nectar and the pollen live, and that's to act as a landing strip for pollinators. Those lines look like neon to them, and they just zoop, go straight to where the nectar is and where the pollen and the seed is to pollinate. These are rosy paintbrush, one of my favorite paintbrushes. We have several species of paintbrush in this area. They're in the snapdragon family, or they were when my guidebook was written. I think they're just so beautiful, and they can hybridize with a couple of other paintbrushes too and make different colors. And the reason why paintbrushes are so very interesting to me is because they are hemiparasites. So they can photosynthesize and make their own food, but they steal basically nutrients from plants around them by kind of suckering onto their roots. Hemi is blood, so they'll like suck nutrients from the plants around them to better fortify themselves. And some members of the snapdragon family, these guys are Elephantella. You might have seen them up in the high alpine, really high elevation and wet spots, and they're in the lousewort group. So the snapdragon family has many different groups. These guys are also hemiparasites, and they like to parasitize a toxic plant that I'll show you kind of in the next slide. And that potentially helps them make their leaves more toxic, so maybe a little less attractive to eat, although elk will browse on the flowers. This is arrowleaf groundsel, and this is in the Senecio group of the sunflower family. And this is the plant that Elephantella really likes to parasitize because it produces toxic compounds, so it's poisonous. So watch out for that one. I would really not be tempted to nibble on Elephantella or anything resembling this plant just because you want to be careful. And then after this, just wanted to show you all a little cinquefoil. This is a really common plant, kind of in the subalpine and higher montane environments at times. It's in the rose family. You can see it's got kind of a serrated leaf. A lot of roses do have that. And it'll have 5 petals when it blooms. It's got that silvery back, hence the foil in the title, cinque for 5 petals, foil for silver. And the rose family is really cool just because we use it so often. We eat raspberries and strawberries. They're in the rose family. And so service berries, big and useful family. Now we'll talk about trees. So here's the aspen tree, like I said earlier, willow family. And I'm sure we've all heard about them being one of the largest organisms on Earth, maybe the largest by acreage. This is all probably one individual aspen, all these clones here. So the root system clones itself thousands of times or more. And so we're all kind of familiar with those general adaptations, but I wanted to show you guys some new ones. So if you look at that color there, it is green, which means that it contains chlorophyll, right? So aspens can photosynthesize without any leaves on, which is just wild to me, because most trees need leaves, right? Aspens can photosynthesize through their bark, which helps them as a deciduous tree at high altitudes. They can grow up to, nearly 10,000 feet. And so these guys will photosynthesize all year round. They also self-prune to save energy, so you saw how easily that branch snapped off with my finger, and you can see that it was already dead. The clones are a bit disease-prone, and so they'll just kill it off, save energy, kind of save themselves the trouble. This is one of our coniferous trees. It is a lodgepole pine. Its needles grow in bundles of 2. These guys are much more fire adapted than our spruce and fir species, so they actually have serotinous cones that need fire to open up. You can see they have a bottle brush kind of shape on their branches, and they don't really grow as much in a triangle as the spruces and firs. That's how I identify them from a distance. They have kind of a brighter green. Then we also have spruces, and you can see these needles are not growing in bundles. They grow alone. To identify a spruce tree for sure, you can see I'm rolling it between my fingers. The needle is square in cross-section, so you'll always be able to roll it easily. It's square, it's spiky, it hurts to poke your finger with it. If you grab the whole branch in your bare hand, it'll usually poke you, unless it's super new. And you can see kind of a classic like triangle shape almost. These guys are monoecious, so they have male and female cones on the same tree. And this is a little baby male cone. Oh, it's so fragile and cute. And it has its pollen. The female tree cones grow high in the tree up at the top, if you can kind of make that out in the video. So they separate them on the tree. And a lot of crumholtz, or crooked wood, crumholtz is the name for these like really little twisty trees that are right on the border of subalpine and alpine environments. You can see the flagging caused by the really harsh winds up there. A lot of those are Engelmann spruce. And most of our spruce trees, especially at high elevation, are Engelmann spruce. We also have blue spruce in the area. So just know that. And I get mad about campfires in the higher environments, kind of high alpine, high subalpine, because they use that dead wood actually to hold on to heat and moisture, and it helps these little baby trees that can be hundreds and hundreds of years old, multiple centuries old, older than this country, right? This like construct of a country. So these really old trees need their dead wood to help them survive, so campfires can really hurt them because you're foraging dead wood from them. This is a gall. So I was talking about how we're in good company, right? We've got lots of parasites in this environment. Everybody's kind of a part of this system of ecology. And so this is a gall caused by a Cooley spruce adelgid, Adelgid. And they lay their eggs in the tip of the branch. You can see the little chambers. The adelgids are gone. All the bugs are gone. They hatched and left. But this is what's left behind. And so it just does it right at the tip of the branch. This is what they look like when they're living on a tree. And they will jump back and forth between a Douglas fir tree and an Engelmann spruce tree in their lifetime. So they need both species in the environment to survive really well. And they typically won't kill a tree, but they can be a part of slowing its growth down. A lot of growth happens at the tips of branches. So by laying their eggs there and changing it, they change that. This is a subalpine fir. You can see its cones are growing upward. A spruces always droop downward. These cones are much more fragile and kind of wet. They have flat, friendly, so flat and soft needles. You will not be able to roll their needles. And subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce are kind of the buddies of our subalpine forests. So those are our two species. And because we have subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce as opposed to just pines, that's why we did okay with the beetle, although that could change. This is honey mushroom. There are several species. This is the other candidate actually for the largest organism in the world, just by biomass. And you might see a lot of dead subalpine firs around. If you're on the wilderness or trails crew, you might be cutting a lot of dead firs that have fallen on the trail. And this mushroom is partially responsible. This mushroom and the western balsam bark beetle work together, and they can well, not on purpose, but if you have both acting, these guys parasitize the roots and can damage the tree that way, and the beetles dig up in the cambium, that living layer right under the bark where the tree's basically like its blood runs. And so if they both attack a fir tree, it's kind of toast. So something to know about the firs, why you see so many dead firs. I included this one because I wanted to include at least one native insect, just kind of in its own right. So you might recognize this little green worm if you've ever tried to grow tomatoes pretty much anywhere. We had them in Missouri, where I grew up, on our tomatoes, and I never knew what they turned into. I always thought they were just kind of a weird, gross, hornworm is the common name. But they're actually caterpillar, and they turn into one of my favorite little insects to see around. They turn into a sphinx moth, which is just so crazy to me because I never really knew that sphinx moths existed until I moved here and started getting more in tune with ecology and the different creatures around here. And these are hummingbird moths. Also, they hover. Sometimes if you think you've seen a hummingbird, you've actually seen a hummingbird moth. I just think they're so beautiful, and they're very important to ecology. They're eaten by many animals. They pollinate flowers. And so while hornworms are a real pain on your tomato plant, you gotta kind of love these moths, right? They're just so gorgeous, and just this big, really cool looking moth. All right, so we'll transition to talking about our wildlife now, our animals. And you can see we're up at the bells, and in the meadow you can see all of these tunnel-looking things. They're actually called eskers. If I kick one apart, it's actually solid in the middle, and it's because the pocket gophers that live here, so we have pocket gophers, they are active all winter long, kind of in the bottom of the snowpack where the temperature is a pretty constant 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 Celsius, so relatively warm compared to how cold it can get. And these eskers are where they were digging through the snow, they smelled something tasty under the ground, they eat a lot of roots and seeds, and they dug down into the ground and they backfilled their snow tunnel with dirt. When they do this, they kind of aerate the soil, they mix everything up, they accidentally, just kind of incidentally, plant some seeds, they destroy some roots, so they really maintain biodiversity, and even though we don't like them in our lawns or gardens, they're really key to our meadows here. This is a pika, most of you probably know, also called a haymaker. It's carrying those flowers to go dry them out in a big hay pile and store food for the winter. They're also active all winter long. They're that cute little animal that when you're passing by a talus field or a field of those big loose boulders, they'll go, "Ee!" So really, really cute. And I also like to talk about the pika because they are so tied to the larger ways in which we affect this system. They are very vulnerable to climate change because they cannot operate if it's too hot outside. So as our climate warms, pika will be retreating to higher and higher elevations where it's cold enough for them to be able to forage. Because again, if it's too hot, they have to stay in the shade, so they can't forage food. So if it's too hot in the summer, a pika can actually freeze to death in the winter because it will not have enough stored food to survive the winter. So they're kind of this interesting little conundrum of, just a really hot summer can mean that a cold winter, even not that cold of a winter, can be really deadly for these guys. So a little bit depressing, especially since they're one of our most charismatic little buddies. They're in the rabbit family, or lagomorphs, so they're more closely related to rabbits. And just adorable, aren't they? All right, this is the elk, or wapiti. Elk were one of the main food sources for Utes as far as meat goes. We still hunt them, and that is part of our economy in ways in the fall. You'll hear them bugle in the fall as well, which is just a really cool sound. And my favorite fact about them is that their herds are often led to different grazing grounds and like kind of sleeping grounds at night. They're often led by a dominant female. So an older cow. They have cows and bulls. This is a bull elk. It's a male. And a dominant cow will often lead the herd around. And like I said earlier, a lot of our elk are descended from elk from Wyoming, imported in 1915. This is a black bear. This is one of our animals that we have to accommodate the most, right? They're just so big. They're these big bruisers. They'll swat mountain lions off their kills. They're like big raccoons. They're so smart. They'll eat almost anything. They actually will forage mushrooms. They eat berries. In the fall, when they're trying to really get fat, they'll eat a lot of acorns and seeds. They eat insects. Sometimes when you see a broken up log on the trail, it's actually because a black bear was breaking it up to look for bugs inside the log and eat them. And they're one of our animals that we struggle with in the wilderness because when they smell our food, they want some. And so we have a bear canister regulation in the Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness just to prevent that. And whenever we're camping, this is an animal that's really big on our minds just because they're so clever and they're really searching for food. So when they hibernate, they'll survive the winter. we have to just constantly be thinking of these guys when we're out. And we have no grizzlies, only black bears here. No grizzlies, not for some time. This is a mountain lion. I just wanted to cover these guys because you might get asked about them, and yes, they are here. They mostly prey on deer. They are really not known to prey on humans very much, although if you've hiked in this area, chances are one has been watching you at some point or another, because they roam very, very far whenever they are hunting or just living their lives. They roam pretty far, and they're natural kind of watchers and stalkers. So you've probably been watched by one or followed for a bit because they're pretty curious. But generally, again, they will leave humans alone, and they're just here to eat deer. And what they'll do is they'll actually ambush these deer. So we have mule deer in this area, not whitetails. I have a hard time getting excited about mule deer here because I grew up with whitetails, and it's just, they're so common. But mule deer are actually a little less common here in the West. And they'll bite the backs of their necks so that they just can't move. They're paralyzed, and then they eat them. They'll drag them off and hide the deer under trees to eat later. So they'll come back to a kill several times to finish eating it. And these deer, you'll see pretty often all over the valley. They move up and down too. And kind of the summer they'll go up, winter they'll go down. Probably also a pretty good food source for the Utes. So yeah, mule deer. Move on to birds. I'll just cover a few birds. This is our endemic species of birds. So they're not really found anywhere else. They're just not found anywhere else in the world. They're relegated to a relatively small area, just in a small area of the Rockies. This is the brown-capped rosy finch. You will not see flocks of them probably in the summer. You'll probably see them in small groups or just kind of singly. They'll be really high up. Even in the winter, they stay pretty high, like 11,000, 12,000 feet, even though they're just a little bird. They like to eat seeds and insects off the snow. These are Steller's jays. You'll definitely see these guys around. They don't have white face markings everywhere they're found. They're found pretty much across the West, but in Oregon, they don't have those white eyebrows and white face markings, just here in Colorado. And they're really smart. They're kind of a nuisance, I guess, at times, but they're just so fun to watch because they're very intelligent. They have kind of raucous voices. I've heard one imitate a red-tailed hawk pretty much perfectly, which was really cool. And I barely missed getting a video of one like fighting a robin over a worm and stealing the worm from the robin. So sorry I missed that because you guys also missed seeing it. So sorry about that, but you'll definitely see them around. They might steal your food, and they'll definitely steal other animals' food if they can. This is the Canada jay. It used to be called a gray jay, but the Canada jay, or whiskey jack, which is kind of a perversion maybe of the Ute name of these birds. I included them because they have a cool adaptation. They have glue-like spit, so if they steal your food or if they find food in their environment, they'll glue it to the tops of trees to store it. And so they kind of use the cold air as a big refrigerator to store their food. And again, they glue their food to trees with their spit. So kind of a weird, cool adaptation of the Canada jay. We've covered lots of ground here. We've covered geology and that massive time scale that's kind of just beyond even our comprehension. We've covered the Utes and their own, honestly, pretty huge time scale. They existed here for thousands of years and were a part of this system for thousands of years, harvesting the plants that we see today and hunting the animals that we know and hunt and love to see today. They were a part of this for longer than our history extends on this continent. And then we have the miners, we have the 10th Mountain Division, the advent of skiing, you know, Len Shoemaker back in the early 20th century, and we have the Pepkeys. So we've covered all that human history, and we've covered a little fragment of the ecology. And of course there's more nuance in the history. There are many stories of people, even more of people of color that I didn't cover, like the railroad workers who built those railroads, just many stories that I didn't have time to cover in this video, but if you are interested, I would completely recommend reading about. I personally could do more reading about them. And of course there's more biodiversity and more ecological stories that I did not represent here. this is enough material for several classes worth of material, so I did what I could, basically. Themes that I think we can find across all of these things are that everything is dynamic. Our geology, our ecology, our human history is really dynamic, and sometimes that change is really scary or outright horrifying and apocalyptic. The geological history, of course, and especially in our early times, there were volcanoes around here like Basalt Mountain, but also the Utes definitely experienced something apocalyptic. The land that they had hunted on and traveled on and camped on for thousands of years was taken from them very, very quickly. They likely experienced quite a bit of illness that they never experienced before in these times, and just amazing, horrifying difficulties. And then we have the various economic downturns and the various wars that people moved here afterward from throughout other parts of history, kind of the wealthy people moving in, and so class issues there, and people who lived here before feeling like their era had ended. And so change is really hard. Change is really challenging. And then in the ecology, we have these relationships that seem kind of harmful and scary, like we've got the Cooley spruce adelgids, we've got western balsam bark beetle and the honey mushroom working on those fir trees, we've got wildflowers that are hemiparasites. So a lot's going on there. But we're not the only species that experiences illness or parasites or death, and we're definitely not the only people in history to weather extreme and often terrifying change. We've caused and contributed a lot of the small apocalypses, a lot of the huge changes in our own history, even in ecology. Climate change right now is doing things that we can't even really understand fully. They're just so huge. But this power can cut both ways. We can not only destroy, but we can heal, we can inspire, we can not only exclude, but we can include, we can listen, and we can grow. We can do good. I'm just going to wrap up with a poem that was a part of an old Wilderness Rangers report and a list of my sources.